Okay, good afternoon and welcome. Dr. Close will be joining us a little bit later. He has a very busy schedule, and so I'm going to have to kick this off by myself. My name is David Satterthwaite. I'm working with the United Cities and local governments on the next global report they're doing on basic service provision, and I'm very delighted to be invited to moderate this session. I think there's just a few comments that are needed before we start on this discussion. This is called Delivering the Urban Advantage, special session on basic services and decentralization. Cities actually have remarkable advantages for health, for quality of life. We see this in average life expectancies in many cities of over 80 years, in some cities of over 85 years. Cities well governed enjoy the lowest infant mortality rate, the lowest child mortality rates, the lowest maternal mortality rates. We see cities providing a very high quality of life. There is an advantage to living there, a health advantage, a quality of life advantage. A large part of this is through the economies of scale and proximity for all the things that make for a healthy city, for a vibrant city. Good water, good sanitation, good drainage, good healthcare, good schools, good emergency services. All of these, there are economies of scale for provision with concentrated populations. But some of the cities I work in, life expectancy at birth is under 50. Life expectancy at birth in some of the cities I work in amongst the low-income communities is less than 20. That was pretty much the same as Manchester in 1841. So it means that there are cities now where there's been no progress in health, in quality of life, since 1841. Concentrate people, concentrate enterprises, concentrate their wastes. With good governance, you get very high quality of life. Without good governance, you don't. So what this session seeks to do is to understand how do you build a basis for good services, good basic services for all. Even if incomes are unequal, we can make basic service provision equal, where everyone gets piped water, sanitation, drainage, healthcare, schools. And of course, local government is at the center of this. It's within their jurisdiction that so many of these basic services are provided, or at least managed and commissioned by other providers. So what we're going to discuss today is the framework, the decentralization framework that supports local government meet those basic needs, and the innovative programs taken by particular governments on improving basic service provision. I will be delighted to invite the four speakers, please, to join me on the podium. That's Greta Uland-Billing, Dr. Sintha Vong, Sushil Kumar, Claire Charbit, and David Truba. No, I don't think so. Yes. Dr. Sintha Vong, could I please invite you to give the first presentation? Dr. Sintha Vong is the Vice Minister in the Ministry of Public Works and Transport in Laos, and he brings with him a very interesting series of slides on how they've addressed basic services. This is your presentation.
Okay.
Let's try this one. No, I think, hang on. It never works quite as easily as this.
Okay.
Oh, here's the expert.
Okay. You put. Yeah. Okay. And then they put here.
This one?
Which one is das?
This one?
Oh, it's okay. It's okay. And then I put here.
Yes.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is my honor to speak to you today at the World Forum 6 special session on the basic service and the decentralization. My name is Dr. Bunchan Sitawong. In my presentation, I will try to provide an overview of the experiences from our country, Laos PDR. So my presentation is the outline, national development context, urban challenges in Laos PDR, government of Laos PDR, and UN Habitat Joint Focus Area. Decentralization in Laos PDR, access to the basic services and the financing, transport and energy, improving the efficiency and accountability of service provision pilot project. So this is, as you see, our country is located with the central of the 5 countries. Our country is a landlocked country. It's with the China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Burma, and Thailand. Our population is about 6.2 million people. So the next national development context, national growth and poverty eradication strategy graduated from LDC by 2020. 7 national and socio-economic development plan 2011 and 2015. Socio-economic development strategy including national urban sector development strategy and government and governance. Regional economic cooperation. So the urban challenges in Laos PDR, rural area, rural-urban migration, urban unbalanced urban-rural development, rapid population growth, and etc. Or the Thai is very short. Okay. Government of Laos PDR and UN Habitat, our advocacy and monitoring partnerships, participatory urban planning, management, and governance, pro-poor and pro-poor land and housing, environmentally sound basics, urban infrastructure, urban service, strengthening human settlement financial system, finance system. So for the decentralization in Laos PDR is under the government policy is very important. But in our country, we say that the delegate the authority to the local government. So many things is very important. According to the Prime Minister Order 16 June 2012, piloting of the building provinces as a strategy unit district, as the strengthened unit, and villages as development units. So that our decentralization is very important in our countries now. So the next decentralization, as I said, that the achievement water and the sanitation related to the MDG and etc. So this I would like to pass. The Thai is very short. The funding flow, as you see, they can see that in the center, the UN Habitat, our Ministry of Public Work and Transport, and the state enterprise, so that we have the chart for this the funding flow. So impact in Laos PDR, increasing demand on the community-based water and sanitation project, rescale up to 9 new towns. A tune introduced by the UN Habitat forming a basis for the urban planning and being used by the different light minister, example, poverty mapping, and etc. So the next, for the transport and energy, the Laopedia government is concerned by the rising concession in capital city and the increase in the personalized vehicle car, and is looking at the public transportation. So, yeah. In the past 5 years, there has been significant expansion and linkage between the sub-regional flow, including the building of the road. The road is increased during the 5 years, about 3,000 up to the 39,000. So we are the construction, the new dam is now is many dam is we are the construction the dam. So the conclusion: improving basic service provision. Adoption of the international guideline on the decentralization and access to the basic service, pilot project, the first, the 1 year, Department of the Housing and Urban Planning, Ministry of Public Works and Transport, and supported by the UN Habitat, helping to improve the efficiency and accountability of the service provision, working with the stakeholder and the collaboration between the municipal sector. So in this event, I would like to thank the UN Habitat to support in our country. So thank you very much.
Could I please invite Sushil Kumar to come and speak about the RAY program? The RAY program, I've been going to India every 6 months for many, many years. And the RAY program represents such an important innovation within the government of India to supporting upgrading and working with the inhabitants of slums and squatter settlements to do so. And I'm thrilled that he's here to give a short presentation on that.
Good afternoon, and I bring greetings from my minister, Kumari Shelja, the Indian Minister for, I don't need it. Okay. Can you, Kumari Shelja, who is the Minister for, Honorable Minister for Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation in India. Just a brief presentation, there is no PowerPoint, but I wish to inform the gathering that India has a major problem of slums in the urban areas. Our urban population, as per the latest census, is around 377 million, of which about 30% are expected to be in slums. So we are talking about providing basic services to about 100 million people. And this ambitious program called RAY, which is an acronym for Rajiv Awas Yojana, the vision of this program is to make India slum-free. We have deliberately not given a time frame. The reason lies in our federal structure of governance, where certain responsibilities rest with the union government, the national government. Certain other responsibilities are with the provincial governments, and land and colonization being with the provincial government, it is essentially the initiative of the state and or provincial government and the local government which has to come. Now obviously this is a program which has been, is a scheme which has been so framed that we need to motivate and give some kind of assistance also, so that each state and each city comes up with a slum-free city plan of action or a slum-free state plan of action. So the scheme proposes to create the enabling conditions to encourage the states to tackle this problem by bringing the slums within the formal system and providing the same basic amenities which are available to the other city dwellers. Means whatever is available to the remaining 66% must be available to the people living in the slums. And it also aims to tackle the shortages of urban land and housing. That is something which affects the poor. So what essentially it hinges on, the program hinges on legislation within 1 year of the acceptance by the state that they will assign property rights to the slum dwellers. Now that's the most critical part of it. Wherever they are residing, prior to a date which is notified, whether it is a private land, whether it is a government land owned by the provincial government, or it is a government land owned by the national government, if it is tenable, means if it is not, say, if it is not, right by the side of a drain or a railway line where it is hazardous to live, then they will be given the rights to that piece of land and they can live there with proper basic services. The second essential part is that it will, the legislation will require the provincial government and the city government to reserve 20 to 25% of developed land for the economically weaker section housing. And the third essential part is that the states and the cities will have to earmark 25% of the annual budget for the urban poor. So these are the three critical aspects on which this entire ambitious program hinges. And we have also made provisions to extract a commitment from the provincial governments about amending their rent control acts. Now, rent control acts came into being in India after the Second World War, and that has created great distortions in housing market. In the same room yesterday, I was speaking about vacant housing units, about 10 million. And many of the people were quite surprised. But that was because this kind of an act was legislated just immediately after the war, and it is heavily skewed in favor of the tenants. And it says essentially that a particular house will have a standard rent, and that is quite minimal, and the person can continue to live there, and the landowner then has no incentive to upgrade that. So we have extracted a commitment that this will be amended and will be replaced by a contractual arrangement between the landlord and the tenant. Also, review of land use policies and simplification of process for housing projects. Now, these are some aspects. In return, what the central government has promised is that if these commitments are given by the provincial governments and the city governments, then 50% for most of the areas grant of whatever is the expenditure for slum upgradation will come from the national government. And in some very difficult areas, this grant could go up to 90%. So those are the stipulations. And what are the other unique parts of this scheme is that we have given time and also funds for preparing a bottom-up plan for this slum upgradation. So we are asking the cities to prepare in a participatory way the slum-free city plan of action. And those will then be given up to the state level. And suppose in a particular state, if we have 50 cities and 40 of them adopt this approach, then all those 40 would be then aggregated, and the state slum-free plan of action will be prepared. And then that will be discussed at the national level and finalized, and then funds will start flowing. So that is essentially a bottom-up approach, keeping in view the idea of decentralization. The other important part of this scheme is that it says whole slum and whole city approach. So I was giving you an example. If suppose a state has 50 cities and 40 of them say they will want to have array in their city, then the entire city, all the slums have to be taken. It's not that you pick and choose on a pilot basis, few of them, and then, essentially that doesn't help. And also, I would say the most unique part of the scheme is, this is the curative aspect that we have been saying. If we have X number of slums, we will take care that X are upgraded. There is a preventive aspect. What to do so that in future slums do not come up. Now, this is an academic, there could be an argument. There are some people who say that you can never prevent slums to come up. But anyway, leave that aside. We are taking certain steps. For example, there are schemes for promoting affordable housing in partnership so that when the urban poor come to the cities, they do not have to perforce go to slums to live. So essentially these are the issues which I wanted to just flag, because we don't have too much of time. But I think this gives you a flavor of the direction in which our national government is moving, and it is one of the highest priority areas that we have given. I hope that this will lead to a better urban future in India. Thank you.
It's just worth remembering that India has the second largest urban population in the world. So the significance of this major national scheme has huge importance. Oh, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Kloos to join us on the podium.
And President Caldoro. Hello. President Caldoro of the region.
Fantastic, great.
Campania.
We were looking for you earlier.
Yeah, President Caldoro here, and hi.
I'll give you my seat for now.
No. We have already one seat more.
Yes,
Huh?
there's a seat for you, sir.
President.
Well, I would like to. This mic working. I will steal this one then. I would like to welcome Stefano Caldoro, President of the regional Campania in Italy, to say a few words to stimulate discussion in this session.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Even though, I apologize for being late and for having walked in during the course of the meeting. Well, we have dealt this issue more globally with the theme of urbanization, the growth of towns, the sprawling towns, the cities of the future. And we must always consider the interest of the individual, of the citizen, of those who are to live in the cities. Well, this is to be a point of reference for the choices of governments, of the local governments, the administrations. So, on the one hand, our glance towards decentralization, the focus on decentralization in order to identify the part of the territory that is closest to the citizens so as to provide answers to their needs, to meet their needs. Distinguish or identify the individuals, their needs, and in particular the young people, therefore the prospects for the future of young people and rights in general, the right to health, right to mobility, the right to a compatible milieu or environment, and therefore improve the overall governance of the territory. This is the task of the institutions. And within the framework of the improvement of the infrastructure, and this is a theme that we are working on at this very moment in our country. So within this area, in the governance that is shared at the different levels, at the different tiers of government, local, regional and state, with regard, and also in the light of our community obligations, there is community legislation which imposes or is in any case binding on certain choices that need to be made. So, well, there are differences at the territorial level. However, we are to promote these changes. Now, with a view to the improvement of services, basic services to begin with, which means ensuring essential rights, the right to a home, to a house, and providing all the basic services that citizens need, like water, sanitation, and health, the rights that they are to be guaranteed. Well, in this area, we need to build or create a system that considers the interests of the citizens and living up to their rights, but also we need the involvement and the contribution of the local authorities. And I am in charge of a local institution, and we are responsible for certain functions in the territory. Well, we are to guarantee the efficient services, not only of the basic services, but also the functions and the sustainability of the territory. The discussion that is underway in the country at this point in time is precisely that of focusing our attention on the management of functions, therefore on ensuring the best service with regard to the essential functions, even before defining an administrative, rigid administrative structure, which means the boundaries of the cities and of the so the boundaries should not should be the result of the are to be identified with the traditional boundaries that that nails down administrative responsibilities. Because unless this happens, it's the citizens who pay for the mismanagement, the government of the territorial areas, the communities that are administered. Well, this community must have few restraints. It must not be throttled by restraints. It must be able to express an innovation in the management of services that are to be ensured to the best of our ability. Now, this meeting, this debate, is a debate that is going on not only in our country but also in the rest of Europe. And we need to learn from the best practices. I think that on the basis of history and for political and administrative parts and so on, there's no one that really is very much ahead of others. The role that we have through the organization of UniHabitat, therefore, those who, around the work of the United Nations, are building up these opportunities for discussing these themes. And we need to do this in a humble manner. We need to hear other people's experience and relate to others. Compare notes with the experiences of others, bearing in mind the challenges of the modern world, especially with regard to the needs of the citizens and the citizens that need services. Well, we can compare notes on how we respond to these needs. So one of the self-criticisms that we can make towards the Italian system is that of having conceived the organization of our towns and our cities in too rigid a manner, and therefore with a straitjacket, let's say, that does not allow for change. It does not allow for innovation, and defining levels of administration and basic services, public services that need to be provided in the best of ways. And often this has led to an inability of providing these basic services in an equal manner with equal rights for all. But there has also been an excessive spending. It has led to excessive spending. When you're governing basic services that do not work, if they're not managed properly, they cost more. They cost much more than they would if they were managed more appropriately. This is the experience also of the Campania region, and there are responsibilities of the local administrations that try to provide as many services as possible, but and therefore running into huge expenses. So we are here to learn from others. We are here to share notes, to compare notes, and we hope that the organizers and others like Jean-Claude, people who are engaged in this area, we hope that we will be able to interact so that we do not restrict our interactions to this event and to these meetings, but that this interaction may continue also in the future. And obviously this is up to our will, to the capacity of UN Habitat to stimulate us to deal with these issues all the more, as much as possible.
Thank you, Stefano Caldoro. It's a phenomenal reminder, a very useful reminder, that local government as a key basic service provider. And, you know, the development debate has forgotten local government, has forgotten its importance, has forgotten how much basic services depend on local governments, how much the Millennium Development Goals depend on local governments. And this was an excellent commentary to remind us of the importance of basic services. With great pleasure, I asked Dr. Kloos also to speak to the meeting. I think you all know that Dr. Kloos is Executive Director of UN Habitat.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to say a few things on relation to this relationship between local governments or decentralization and access to basic services. I've been in a group of mayors when I was mayor that we were advocating through UN Habitat at that time. I was never thinking by then that I would be the executive director of UN Habitat. I was the chairman of UNACLAC, which was the advisory body of local authorities to UN Habitat. We were advocating the approval and generalization for all the world of the European chapter of local government, self-government. The European chapter of self-government is an international treaty which has now quite a number of countries which have signed it, and it relates to, it states in this treaty very clear that every signatory of this, every government signing this treaty is accepting the fact that they should provide in their constitution autonomy or capacity of self-government to local authorities. There are plenty of countries where still local authorities or regional authorities, they don't have capacity of self-government. They are a kind of administrative office of the central government. And of course this is something that politically in quite a number of countries it's evolving through a real empowerment of local authorities. I must confess to you that when I am in front of the word decentralization, which I understand very well, and it's the word that it has been used for that, I am a little bit worried, especially now that I have much more experience with poor countries. You know, poor countries, they are very poor. And central governments in poor countries, they are also very poor central governments. And you manage them with decentralization, they tend to react against it, because they think that they are going to lose the few resources that they have. I rather think that tactically it would be important if we advocate the same idea, but with another slightly different power. And this is, my proposal is to talk about empowering local authorities and regional authorities. Because I think that this is the problem of the governments, that the power that the weak central governments allow to the regional governments and local governments, it's weak. And as there's no power, there's no resources. There's no fiscal capacity for poor local authorities. There's no fiscal capacity or delegation for regional governments. And I think that the main question, and I totally agree that the local governments and regional governments are fundamental in order to address the problem of basic services. In fact, if you look at the history of humanity, all basic services, they have begun at the local authority. If you look at the Romans, you know, the Romans and the drainage of the cities of Rome, we had the other day the possibility to see the drainage of Pozzuoli, or what was the name of the city? Pozzuoli, huh?
Rione Terra di Pozzuoli.
Pozzuoli. We saw the drainage system and the water distribution system of 2,200 years ago. By the way, the drainage system was already divided, or the collection, between a specific drainage system for rain, a second line for dirty waters, and a third line for water, clean water, which in many countries and many cities, even today, we don't have. And all this was done through the local authorities. I remember the history of our own cities, where the part of the world that I come from, in Barcelona, which was a kind of city-state, when in the 12th century, 13th century, the rich part was the city, and the poor part was the king. The king had no money. The city had money. And usually when the king was involved in wars, they came to the city to ask for men, horses, food, in order to do the war. And it was the king who was begging the city for money. And now, when are we talking about, a city wants to build a transportation system, a city wants to build a drainage system. It's the other way around. It's the mayor who goes to the president of the government, of the minister of finance, to beg the money and to wait there in the waiting room hours and hours until the minister has a little bit of time to see the mayor. Then I think that what is the issue is that in a world that is urbanizing, a new architecture of finance, public finance, should be developed in the nation state in order to guarantee that local and regional governments, they have, the capacity to finance. Sometimes this is not fresh money. Sometimes this is delegation of power, especially fiscal power. And this is why I like the concept of empowering local authorities and regional governments. It's a question not just of distributing between the different levels of administration, the different scarce resources, but it's a question of agreeing in a new political structure by which, or in it, where the local authority, it has its autonomous power, self-capacity, of course, under the scheme of general governance, but that has been explored in the federal, confederal, decentralized. We have plenty of countries which show very different traditions on that. You go to the Scandinavian countries and they are, they are local governments self-governed because they were the country was founded by the local governments in assembly. Yeah? Then if you go to the Confederation of the 4 states of Switzerland, you see that the federal government, it's a kind of a rotatory thing. That you know the president of Switzerland? No, you never will know the president of Switzerland because they change every 2 years or every year, and it is rotatory. And the real power is in the on the 4 regions. Or you have now one successful history, which is very surprising. Nowadays, Germany. Nowadays, Germany, it's a federal state. And it's a very interesting case because the Constitution of Germany was written down in a federation in order to avoid the big Germany. It was imposed by the, more or less, the winning countries of the Second World War as a mean to make sure that Germany will keep, you know, in a sense, controllable by the different powers. And what has happened? A really well-designed, decentralized country with a culture of democracy has become a huge success. But this is not always the, you know, that's politics. I cannot, I don't discover anything if I say that the organization of the country is one of the most political thing, no? In my own country, Spain, during the dictatorship, of course, we were a monolithic, centralized country, etc. Then, with the new constitution, with democracy, we nearly have built something like in Germany, an autonomous decentralization in 17 autonomous communities, and with a strong capacity of, for local authorities. But now that we are in crisis, there's a group of people in my country who say the problem, the responsibility because we are in crisis is because we are a federal state. Because all those regions, they spent a lot of money, and all those cities, they spent a lot of money. It's a very weak argument, because the winning country nowadays, Europe, which is Germany, it's a decentralized country. And you could say, come on, you have one example of a federal system and decentralized country which has been very successful, and another one which has been not so successful. But don't blame decentralization of lack of control, okay? The solution to the problems of, if any time emerge, of decentralization is to improve the quality and the controls of the decentralization, not to avoid decentralization, come on. Not to kill the idea, to improve the idea. But there's a lot of people who uses some, you know, temporary weaknesses in order to kill the idea of decentralization or empowering local authorities. In any way, of course, I am a total fan or convinced. I am a Catalan, etc. I am totally convinced of decentralization, of well-done decentralization, with mechanisms of solidarity, etc., because I think that the best thing that we can do in political life is to approach the policy to the citizens. Because if the politicians are there in the, you know, in the ivory tower, far away, are untouchable, then there's no way that the population can really do a democratic control of what is going on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to invite Greta Ulan Billing, the Deputy Director General of the Norwegian Ministry of Local Government and Regional Development, to speak. And I'm going to warn my friend Jean-Pierre Mbassi that you will be invited after this to respond to Dr. Claus, reflecting on the importance of decentralization and basic services in Africa.
Thank you. Is the mic on? Yeah. And also thank you to you, Mr. Claus, mentioning the Nordic countries. And I can confirm that local authorities were in place before the national government in my country, Norway. Local authorities were there in 1837. We had our freedom from Sweden in 1905. So we have a strong tradition for local authorities, and we also have a strong tradition developed for working together. So I think multi-level governance is the way forward. My position here today is to represent my ministry, who is the Ministry of Local and Regional Development, but also to give a flavor of the history, which also Dr. Claes gave a little perspective on. But my point is to say that as a national government representative from a well-functioning democracy, we have homework to do. We all have homework to do to improve issues on strengthening the local democratic life for citizens. And Norway has actively supported the UN Habitat in developing the issue on decentralization. The first resolution on this issue was 21.3 on guidelines on decentralization and strengthening of local authorities, approved in 2007. The next in 2009 on the access to basic services for all, and the latest resolution from 2011 on the coordinated implementation of the two sets of guidelines. And this is where we are now. We are trying to follow up these ideas and implementations. My point here is now to say that this normative work is very valuable. It has been successfully developed by UN, outlined in now two sets of guidelines, and we shall all follow up. And in the resolution from 2011, it addresses very clearly what the different partners of these guidelines have to do. But let me first also say that the UN Habitat conference in the UN Habitat II conference in 1996 in many ways lifted local authorities to be the first among the Habitat Agenda partners. UN Habitat has since then been perhaps the most important UN body for local authorities to work with. Internationally, they now have a home, to put it very briefly. And I also have worked in the Council of Europe for many years, so I know the importance of having a home where you can move forward together. So I think that is very important, and UN Habitat had done a great job to bring us there and to invite the local authorities to our home. But I think, is this resolution text with the normative principles, who has proved to be sustainable since they were adopted? We are now in the implementation phase, but nevertheless, they have high quality. They are good. I have not heard anyone challenge the quality of the text itself. So, but I think we need a strategy for communication. I think that's very important that the UN Secretariat has an important role to disseminate information on the normative principles in the guidelines, to put in place a communication strategy so that all partners and citizens have the same reference framework to build on, to promote and give arguments in dialogues. Today, communication in our world is everything. I mean, the media, we know the headlines, and all citizens, all partners need information. And how can then UN Habitat make these guiding principles more visible and worldwide and available to all? The second point at this stage of my intervention is to say that the conference planned for UN Habitat 3 in 2016, how can we prepare for that? The Norwegian State Secretary said in the Ministers' Roundtable on Monday that she wanted to see the decentralization themes reported there and further strengthened. That was her position. I started this intervention by referring to resolutions. I'll now briefly inform you of some of the main paragraphs in the homework lessons we got in 2011 in that resolution. Because I think it's important, and I'm sure it needs to be disseminated. Paragraph 2, in brief, invites government to step up efforts to adapt and implement the 2 sets of guidelines in a coordinated manner and according to national circumstances by reviewing and improving their legislation, including strategic planning and improve financial mechanisms for ensuring access to basic services for all. Today, from the table here, as well as yesterday, we have heard that countries and national governments are working on that follow-up issues. We have heard many countries, Comoros, Togo, Mozambique, Burkina Faso, India. And in other rooms where I haven't been, I'm sure the report from this forum will give us all the list. And what has then Norway done? We also have homework to do. How do we work? I will say that there are many ways to follow up the guidelines. We have the Norwegian minister, she has signed an MOU with India, my partner here. And the issue is to work on good governance at local level, involving local municipalities in both countries, and also research done. This MOU was signed in 2010. Next week, the partner from India, which is in India they have minister for urban issues and one for rural issues, to put it shortly. And that means it is the one for the Panchayati Raj, who is the partner now for developing this agreement on working together between India, the largest number democracy of the world, and one of the smallest, with high quality in Norway. But it's possible, working together, learning from each other. And I'll go on to the resolution text, paragraph 3 and 4. It invites and urges all relevant United Nations entities to engage systematically in a dialogue with the UN human settlements programs to ensure that their initiatives related to shelter and basic services benefit from the 2 sets of guidelines. And what has then UN done to integrate in their projects, which are already in place, not new projects, but already existing ones, and other entities, what they are doing, how to follow up the decentralization agenda. And to conclude, there are more homework for all of us to do, but I'll underline that I think that to build the political will around the world, we need information and we need a communication strategy. We need a platform based on modern technology, and I'm sure all partners will be interested in discussing how that could be developed and also to contribute to it. Thank you.
Now, may I invite Jean-Pierre Mbassi to come to the podium and just give a commentary. He's Secretary General of the United Cities and Local Governments, but there is no one I know who knows with such depth and detail local government and basic service provision in Africa.
This is not fair. And, well, thank you for your appreciation. Thank you, Dr. Klaus, and other panelists for your contribution and input. Now turn your remark into French. Do you have headsets? I will continue in French, if you don't mind. Je suis d'accord.
And Dr. Klaus, I agree. I definitely agree that poor countries often present major issues when you speak to them of centralization. The real issue is strengthening the ability of public powers to take action, and decentralization is seen as splitting that or reducing that ability to act. It seems to whittle away at that ability, and the result of dividing poverty into smaller pieces is seen as creating more poverty. And that leads many to suggest that it would be better to concentrate public resources in the hands of a strong national power, and only after that is done will it become possible to move on to real and effective decentralization. That is the current theory and also the practice of most of our governments today in Africa. And what we, as local authorities, and those who work for local authorities are instead suggesting is that in actual fact the history of the nations of the world has shown that it's been local authorities who have won over governments and not the other way around. Take the case of Africa. The states were inherited, ready-made from colonization. Some people met in Berlin in 18-something, drew up the maps, and that is what we are living with now. These are states that were never negotiated with the people who live there, with the people who form the communities that live in those nations today. So decentralization actually presents us an extraordinary opportunity to renegotiate the legitimacy of these states. States which are instead a legacy that we simply were subject to. We can therefore see decentralization as a way of bolstering the legitimacy of our states, and also a way for our populations to take ownership of our nations. I'm saying so, and apologize once again for referring to colonization, but colonization did have the objective of dealing with civilization. The idea was that they were bringing modernity to the peoples and therefore financing civilization. But what was hidden to the people was actually that they were financing what was happening in their countries. And that is why customs rights are very important for countries too, because that is a source of income to the governments, and they are paying it through their consumption. Indirect taxes are being paid by the people. And instead, states try to convince the people that the states are bringing in modernization, just as colonization was presented as a way of bringing civilization to the people. Decentralization turns that on its head. It's another discourse. It's a way of saying to the people, if you want service, well, you have to pay for it. Now, obviously, the culture of African local government is generally a culture that is fearful of telling the truth to the people. When the people ask for service, the stock and trade answer is, well, the government hasn't given us money for that. Instead of saying, you want the service? Okay, and let's see how much it will cost, and let's see how you can pay for it, and how we can maintain this service. So it's very important to understand this. Decentralization for us is educational. It's an act of refounding our states. It's a way of taking ownership of public institutions. It's a way for the people to take ownership. And it's also very healthy for the states themselves. It's a way of increasing the size of the pie. It's not so much a question of customs duties, for instance. We've signed our customs agreements, and about 40% of the customs duties that are currently financing public coffers today are going to disappear. We come to these custom unions agreements. So we need a transition period during which local governments will be playing a very crucial role of re-engaging the people and showing them the need to finance the economy. I'll conclude this brief remark by saying that we need to convince both central government and our local government, our local authorities, that basic services are part of economic policy. They shouldn't be, it's not simply costs, it's also income generation, and it's a way also creating jobs. So we need to change our outlook. And I can tell you that in Africa, small producers of water, small suppliers of water in the neighborhoods are generating millions of francs in business. Unfortunately, often at the cost of the poorest part of the population. So reorganizing our basic services is a major contribution to the economy, and all of this is what we talk about when we talk about access to basic services. Thank you.
Fantastic, Jean-Pierre. Is this? Yeah, fantastic. The only difficulty is whenever anyone mentions colonial governments in Africa, everyone looks at me because I'm English. Very embarrassing. I'd like to invite David Truber from the Water Supply and Sanitation Collaborative Council to make his presentation. And then Stephen Young, I will invite you to respond to this presentation.
This one. Yeah. Apologies for the delay. Dr. Close, Mr. Calderon. I will powerfully abridge my presentation because we're running short on time, and I know it's very important that we get to the dialogue and reflection period in this session. So my name is Dave Truba. I'm from the Water Supply and Sanitation Collaborative Council. WSSCC it's a bit of an oddity. It's in the UN system. We're a part of officially UNOPS, the United Nations Office for Project Services, but we also work more like an international NGO. And today I've been asked to look at theme 3 in particular, responding to the needs of youth, women, and excluded peoples and the efficacy of the rights-based approach. So I'll try to do that, but again, I'll go through everything quite quickly, and I'm happy to talk to people afterwards and certainly engage in a dialogue one-on-one if you like. But I'm talking about this topic from the point of view of sanitation because many of the same principles apply to services for water supply and also to solid waste issues. But WSSCC focuses more on sanitation and hygiene in particular, so that's where we'll have as our entry point. And sanitation happens to be the most off-track target within the Millennium Development Goals, as I'm sure many of you know, so it's an important topic. 2.5 billion people in the world don't have access to safe sanitation. 1.2 billion of them go on the ground every day. The sanitation target won't be met until the year 2049. It's way behind. Actually, in provision of services for water supply and sanitation in urban areas, you can see that it's been declining over the last 10 years. There has been progress, but because of the rapid expansion of urban areas, that progress hasn't been able to keep up with the provision of those services. Now, in that theme, excluded peoples and the efficacy of the rights-based approach, this is what I really wanted to focus on. Who are the excluded people that we're talking about? Whose interests are we trying to extend a right to water and sanitation to? Well, the excluded, it's a very complicated and cross-cutting word, because you can talk about people from a rural or urban perspective being excluded by gender, by class, by occupation, geography, caste, religion. In urban areas, you might have untouchables in some parts of the world. You might have pastoralists in other parts of the world. But what they generally share in common, and this is what the people who are looking quite intensely into the water, sanitation, hygiene, and non-discrimination targets of the next set of global sanitation goals are looking at, are the characteristics of age, gender, and physical accessibility. So when we're talking about equity and inclusion, equity is the principle of fairness. Inclusion is the process of ensuring that all people are able to participate fully. And this session has a very, very important focus on local government, local authorities, which is absolutely vital. It's absolutely fantastic. You'll see when I give a couple of examples later that this isn't necessarily local authorities who are maybe having these successes, but they are the ones who create the empowering environment for success to occur. Now, barriers faced by people who are excluded can be attitudinal. People might be looked down upon, and there might be prejudice against certain groups. There could be environmental. There might be physical problems with, let's say, sanitation facilities and urban slums, certainly in rural areas as well. And they might be institutional. There might not be policies or financing mechanisms in place which add to the extra burden of these people who are already excluded. So the challenges to equity and inclusion are this. There's a poor understanding of the WASH needs and the access constraints of these marginalized people. Equity and inclusion is rarely explicit in policy and practice. Monitoring is very weak. If there are toilets been built, it's often assumed that it's been used. Actually, lots of times it's not. I mean, we've all heard the stories of, in different parts of India, for example, toilets that were built but weren't used for different reasons. Sometimes it's because the people, they didn't demand them themselves. Sometimes they were because the structure was actually more solid than the person's home, so it was more useful to store bicycles than to store grain. There's poor data on those who are left out, and people without sanitation face stigma, discrimination, and further marginalization. But it's not all bad news. There's actually very, very good news. I'm going to give 4 quick examples of how the excluded people are actually included. And again, most of these are done through NGOs who are working in environments that have been empowered and supported by local governments, but there's a very specific local government example at the end. When we talked about people having physical or environmental barriers, well, there are ways of overcoming this. As you can see from this example, in Madagascar, Handicap International helped the NGO WaterAid to actually modify toilet designs. They actually asked the disabled people, well, what works and what doesn't? And as you can see from the second bullet, there are some points people are saying, well, the gate opened the wrong way, or the ramps were too steep. So you have to involve the people in the design. When it comes to the point of view of age, you have to, for example, if you look at the third bullet here, a raised pedestal for a comfort of the child who's actually going to be using the toilet. I mean, you have to know a child, you have to ask a child if that's helpful to be able to build that into the design. And in Bangladesh, a couple of NGOs were especially cognizant of the fact that menstrual hygiene management is a huge issue. Women, on average, menstruate over 3,000 days in their lifetime, and in places where they don't have a safe, clean environment to do it, or they don't have access to sanitary pads, or places where they can clean those sanitary pads, it's a huge infringement on their dignity and their health. So UN Habitat in particular has been fantastic in its work in urban areas and peri-urban areas, particularly in places like Nepal, where they've established user committees, they've worked with the local government, and in this particular case they were able to establish round-the-clock water supply and sanitation coverage. Okay, I probably only have about 5 minutes left, Dave, is that right? I'll speed it up. 4, all right. As you've all heard, there is now sort of a policy roadmap ahead via the Human Rights Council's declaration, or the General Assembly's declaration of water and sanitation as a human right. If you look across other declarations or human rights, the rights of disabled people, the rights of children, you'll see access to WASH services implicit in those. But this was a very explicit declaration of the right for people. I'll go through this very quickly. Again, I apologize about that. There are a lot of misconceptions. The right entitles people to free water or sanitation. That's not true. People are expected to contribute financially or to the extent that they can. The right entitles everybody to household service. No, just service that's nearby. A country is in violation of the right if not all the people have access to water and sanitation. No, that's a misconception also. The important thing here is this phrase, progressive realization of the right, which means that national governments and also local governments must make the political commitment to water and sanitation. They must commit financial resources to it. You see this happening in Southern Africa through the Itaquini Declaration and Africa Action Plan, which came out of a regional sanitation conference in Africa a couple of years ago. Sector reform, and then, make plans for progressive realization. And then you see here in red, involve the community so that you know what they need in terms of services. Just a brief word about Habitat's work in the right to water and sanitation. It's fantastic. I mean, you can go in each of these programs, and there's lots of documentation on it, and you can see how Habitat has really been pioneering in the way that it demonstrates community approaches in partnership with local government, service providers, and communities. Highly encourage you to look up their information. Urban governance, local governments is very important. Local governments need to ensure or create the enabling environment where there's a regular supply of good water quality, but also that these issues don't become siloized. I know that there are some friends from WaterAid here who have talked about citywide planning. Planners of water and sanitation services need to consult with the other departments within the local governments because these things can't be done independently. Again, the needs of people need to be considered as well. And moving on, many stakeholders. This idea of equity and inclusion is being also an important part of the discussions that are going on regarding post-millennium development goals, or those that come in after 2015, often referred to as the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's being led, this effort, on the consultations by UNICEF and WHO, where there are recommendations for new goals, new targets, and new indicators being developed. And actually, everybody in this room, everybody watching on the UN Web TV, and it's a fantastic service to be able to provide that, can go onto this website and you can comment on the wording, the targets, the indicators. This is a very open process, so you're happily invited to go in and do that. But the point is that these goals, unlike maybe the UN, the Millennium Development Goals, which, as we know, were negotiated outcomes, they're really meant to be aspirational, measurable, and of global relevance so that everybody can really get behind them. So, just to sum up quickly, the take-home messages are these. Access for all is better for all when it comes to water and sanitation in our burgeoning cities. And this is very much congruent with the Habitat approach to adequate shelter for all. Community-based approaches that ensure partnership between stakeholders are an effective way of advancing the right. Often these days you hear about rights holders, duty bearers. Duty bearers are the local governments. They might be the community groups. The rights holders are the individuals themselves, particularly those who are the excluded. We need to address all aspects of the right, so this is for water and sanitation, sufficiency, safety, accessibility, affordability, availability, and allocation and sustainability. With local awareness, political will, innovative solutions, and equity and inclusion, progress can be made. Collaboration is better than confrontation. Funds are needed, but it's not the most important constraint. In Ethiopia, there was a WASH program that was expanded by 2 to 3% of its budget so that it could really reach out to excluded groups. So it was much more inclusive for just a little bit more money. Governance must be pro-poor, and projects and programs at scale have the potential to demonstrate the rights-based approach. UN Habitat, as I mentioned earlier, is doing that. WSSCC, through implementation of something we call the Global Sanitation Fund, is doing that, where in areas where this fund is operating or funding sanitation-related work, we're making sure that marginalized people are included. Lots of resources on the Habitat website. If you want to know more about equity and inclusion or sanitation, you can go to WSSCC's website and access what we call the Sanitation 101 Toolkit. And not to end on a somber note, but actually an inspirational one, because she was an inspirational person. I just wanted to dedicate this presentation to a person named Noma Nseni, who was the Executive Director of the Institute of Water and Sanitation Development in Zimbabwe. She was also a human rights commissioner. She passed away, unfortunately, last week, and rather suddenly, and she was one of the most passionate and inspiring people that I've ever met when it comes to the issues of sanitation, hygiene, and water supply for excluded people. Sanitation is a passion, not a job. I became a human rights commissioner because of toilets. What is gender equality or poverty alleviation when we are forced to defecate in the open? Thank you very much.
May I invite Stephen Young, the Head of Profession of Infrastructure for the Department for International Development in the UK.
Good. Thank you, David. Honoured speakers, guests, it's good to be with you. We've heard an awful lot, haven't we, in a short time. We've had a lot of examples. We've had a lot of pictures of different countries at different stages of the whole decentralisation process. Those like the Campania region, where we are here, delivering very effectively their services. Spain and Barcelona, Norway. We've heard of India's approaches to actually removing slums across the whole of their nation. What a huge challenge they've set themselves there. And as the speakers were talking, it caused me to reflect a little bit on my own experiences. And I remember very well, about 6 or 7 years ago, I was in India and went down to Hyderabad in Andhra Pradesh in the south of the country, where DFID had been working for 20 or 30 years, actually, in delivering and helping the municipality to deliver basic services there. And I was thinking about some of the key steps that had been taken to help that effectiveness of service delivery. And I think we've seen them very well illustrated here today. First of all, of course, there was the enabling legislation, that framework which actually gave the authority to the municipalities to do the job of delivering the basic services. There was a capacity issue, and again, capacity has been talked about very much today. You know, it's no use having the power given to you if you don't then have the capacity to deliver. And so I remember very well going to meet the municipal officers there and having a passionate discussion with them about the way they had improved their basic services, talking about the people they were serving and delivering services to as clients, as customers, rather than just receivers of a service that was handed out to them. On the wall, there was the Citizens' Charter, which set out the responsibilities of the municipality and what they'd agreed to do. How they would actually deliver within a few days that service connection if you asked for it. But of course, a charter is always a two-way thing. And beneath that, we had the rights that they would expect from their citizens, from their receivers, that they would pay their bills, that they would report problems with the system, that they too would play their part in that contract, if you like, for the service provision. Of course, there's a question of affordability, and again, a number of the speakers have referred to that. I was impressed there that what had happened actually was the municipal's revenue had more than doubled. And that had been done by a systematic sort of working through the land registration, working on the tax revenues, working persistently to draw those in, but also, of course, as the service level improved, so people were happier to pay their taxes and revenues. And so we could see how that compact had developed. And actually, through that decentralised process, basic services were being driven. And I think we've seen that very well illustrated by the examples we've seen today. That as Laos now starts to go down this urbanisation, this decentralisation route, how the rights of the people are seen as central to what they're doing, their right to the basic services, and then taking the steps to put that into place. And I think more than anything, as we look at decentralisation, as we look at this capacity building, financial empowerment, we also need to recognise the need to bring in the citizens as well, to actually empower the local communities too, to be appropriate consumers of those services, that they too know their rights, but as well their responsibilities. We've seen the report card type of approach being very effective in allowing citizens to come back to municipalities on the services they're being given. And as we see people empowered through that process, we actually see them move through the system, so the poor people who were once the recipients of the system then become some of the elected politicians whose duty is to deliver those services, and also, of course, who know very well what the requirements are for those services. So I think we've seen that very well illustrated today. Decentralisation, I think for many countries it is a journey to make that a very effective delivery of services to all of the people. But I think we've seen how, with good governments, with goodwill, with the right approaches, that actually can work very effectively. And I'm sure we would all wish India great success in its mission as it seeks to eliminate slums and all that means in India. So thank you.
Now I'd like to invite Claire Charbit, the Deputy Head of the Regional Development Policy Division in OECD, to discuss how to improve multi-level governance coordination for more efficient and effective services. I should just add, before she starts, of course, that in climate change adaptation, multi-level governance is absolutely fundamental, and it's sometimes through looking at the risks that cities face from climate change we're reminded of how much nested collaborating levels of government have to work with each other. So I hope she's going to direct us and advise us. I'm with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, how to get multi-level governance to work there too. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you very much. So I'm Claire Charbit from the OECD. I'm very honored and pleased to be here and want first to thank our hosts, so UN Habitat, of course, and Joe in particular for his help and the help of his team, and of course the region of Campania and Naples City for such a wonderful welcome. So here I will concentrate on things we heard about in a very direct way. We are interested in implementation issues because good principles are a good thing, but the key issue remains in the way you implement them. So we are looking for the devil in details, in a sense, and we try to find solutions to implement good practices in terms of managing public policy in decentralized context. So, as just mentioned, decentralization is a journey. You will see that the main message is that there is no optimum, but rather a great variety of approaches. The OECD is quite famous for working for the club of rich countries, less and less the case, and we are more and more interested in partnership with other countries, and we worked a lot on other cases in the world. So I bring with me some cities review, for instance, in South Africa, and we also worked on different things. Another thing, OECD is also well known for statistics and macroeconomic policy assessment. In practice, we are more and more interested in subnational action, since subnational governments are really key players in terms of efficiency, equity and stability issues. They directly contribute to national and global goals. So I will skip some of them. So comparison. In OECD countries, on average, subnational government, which means cities and municipalities, and regions, they represent 22% of public revenue and 1/3 of public spending. But you better know than I do that average doesn't mean a lot. There are some theoretical arguments that you may have in mind, but I will not enter in details. For supporting decentralization, of course, you are closer to people. Of course, you reveal local preference. Of course, you create some kind of stimulation through competition among local authorities. But above all, because it's a democratic principle, it's really a political issue, and I never seen any country aiming to decentralize more or less because of economic reasons. Above all, it's really a political decision-making, even if it has very strong and important economic and social consequences. And so sector by sector, policy field by policy field, you may have economic assessment and evolution of things. But for the general principle, is much more political motivation than something else. These are the pros. Of course, there are also cons, and in particular the fact that when competition among local authorities is too high, they are raised to the bottom issue. You remove some standards for delivering green public services in order to attract private investment. You remove equity concerns because you just want to preserve some jobs, etc., and you want, above all, to be re-elected. So there are a series of inefficiencies that have already been observed. In this context, nobody can say there is one optimal level of decentralization, let's us reach it and just adopt this institutional setting in the best way. In practice, you need some decentralization, but not a full autonomy, and some centralization, but not a full autocracy. So in practice, the competence which is the most allocated to subnational government is public investment. We just heard about infrastructure. It's clearly one key competence of local authorities, even if, again, there are many differences and strong differences among countries. What are the competences? Sorry, you need your glasses. What are the competences which are the most allocated to subnational government? Housing. So we are in the urban forum, you know what I mean. Environment protection, which means water, energy, and so on, again. Recreation, culture, religion, again. Cities are really key actors in this thing. Education, and even if education represents more than 50% of public spending for subnational government, it is really different according to countries you observe. You may have countries where education is really decentralized and other, like my country in France, for instance, where it is not at all the case, or apparently decentralized, but not so much in practice. So what we can say is that there is much more trends like regionalization of some specific services. Everywhere we have observed regionalization of health services and hospital in particular. For education, you have slices. University are more central and primary school are more local. So you have this kind of general trends. So until now I have mentioned data based on spending, so data related to financial dimensions. But in practice, the real autonomy is not just financial. The autonomy of local authority and local government is something which is a complex and a system. You may have policy autonomy. Do you have the full control on the thing you want to do at the local level? Do you fully control your budget? Never. Do you control the input? Well, rarely, because very often civil servants' wages are decided by central government and negotiation between unions and central government ministries. So do you decide about your outputs? More or less, because you have to obey to some standards in delivering them. Do you control the way you evaluate and monitor your services? Well, not, but I think it's not a bad thing, because what we need is the ability to compare and identify good practices. So above all, what we have observed is rather than autonomy or control, we are in a process of mutual dependence among levels of government. Dependence because more and more central government give spending responsibility to subnational government, but in practice they control the revenues. More and more they always had in practice, to take into account the place-based specificities. Equalization issues, customization of public policies need to be place-based. It has not always been the case. We also noticed that central government tried to control more and more ex post the policy making by implementing performance measurement and the adequation of public policy to standards, as well as condition the grant they will give to specific conditionalities in the delivery of subnational government. So managing interdependency means what in practice? First, you need to know who is doing what. And to be frank, it's not an easy game. Just as an illustration, we worked on water a lot. And so this is a map of water resource management in Italy, where you can see the allocation and type of linkages between the different levels of government and agencies. And you can observe, for instance, that at the river basin, you have different type of authorities, and you create overlapping negotiation, transaction, and so on. So coordination failures, in a sense. I will not enter in details for water services. We try to rationalize the type of coordination failures. And I guess many type of gaps we have identified will echo, in a sense, to your ears. First of all, the administrative gap, which is so crucial for metropolitan areas. Administrative gaps mean that the administrative boundaries, they do not fit with the functional areas. They do not fit with the boundaries of metropoles. They do not fit with a hydrological reality. So you need to find a way to recreate, in a sense, boundaries at the relevant level. Information gap. Information gap, local government, they do not know very well what central government wants, and vice versa. Policy gap, it's an important one. It's very difficult to develop relevant strategy at the subnational level, mobilizing different public policy fields, if at the central government level there is no coordination among line ministries, because local authorities, they receive many administrative conditions, and it's very difficult to engage in this process. Capacity gap, very famous, we work on that. Funding gap also. Objective gap is more related to political economy reason. And accountability above all. Very often, central governments say, we don't want to decentralize because we do not trust subnational government. Well, the reciprocal, it is also true in the other sense. So I heard that I have to hurry on. So for addressing these different gaps, we have identified a series of mechanisms: contracts among levels of government, performance if it's well managed, and always a good example of some bench learning processes comparing the performance of the national authorities in the way they deliver their mandate, their public services, agencies, and so on. I will not enter in detail, but you will have access to the presentation, I hope. Water is a specific case. I do not have time. One key issue: we need to build and reinforce and enhance capacity at the subnational level for making these authorities credible actors in the process of deciding about public policy. But building capacity is really a challenge for many reasons, and we are developing in the OECD a framework and a methodology for assessing and supporting policy for enhancing subnational capacities. Conclusion. This is a conclusion. Examples of related activities. We are producing multi-level governance principle on public investment. We are producing methodology and work on subnational capacity. We work also on local public enterprises, and we all know that it's always a room for some corrupted behavior. We worked a lot on multi-level governance of water, urban trends and governance for many different aspects, including green cities. We work on post-disaster, and in particular for L'Aquila, not so far from here. We worked on financial relation among levels of government and some kind of incentives and conditionality. So all these things, I bring some issues of that. If you have a specific interest, please speak and interact with us with great pleasure and interest.
I should tell you a little bit of the history of this session. We actually lost two very good speakers unexpectedly. And I think with our enthusiasm, we've developed this fantastic list of people who were originally here and replacements. And what we're doing is we're trying to do a whole day's agenda in 2 hours. I am afraid there won't be time for questions, because we've got 5 more speakers. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to be very unfair. I'm going to say that each of them has got 2 minutes. And so this is just to prepare you a little. I'm also very grateful to the speakers. They came with presentations that were 20, 25 minutes, and I then said 10 minutes. If someone had said that to me, I would have been furious. And I'm very grateful to all those that cut down their thing. So the people that I'm going to invite up now, in a sense, think of the two really key issues that you want to emphasize as we move out of this building on decentralization, on basic services. We know the topic is hugely important. We've had many rich and interesting examples. And I very much apologize for restricting you to 2 minutes. Hubert Julien Leferrière, the Vice President of Greater Lyon Region, I'd be delighted for you to come and make those points. Incidentally, it's often more difficult to speak for 2 minutes. 10 minutes is easy because you waffle. 2 minutes is really tough.
In my jurisdiction, I also have Francophonia, so I hope you allow me to speak in French, actually. If there is translation, yes, there is. Quand je regarde
When I look at this round table and other round tables that I followed from the beginning of the World Urban Forum, and when I look at the conclusions, the outcome of Rio Plus 20, I feel that we've lived for a long time in a sort of paradoxical situation in which local issues were at the center of global debate, whether it was sustainable development or development aid effectiveness or urban development. So local issues were at the core, but local stakeholders, local players often were not. And in international conferences, we very rarely had representatives of local government participating in roundtables, whereas all we would do was talk about how important they were and how important it was to take action in the field, in the territory. But we simply never engaged with local government. And very little was said in international conferences about the role and responsibilities of local authorities in meeting the challenges. The situation has changed a little now, perhaps even substantially so, thanks to UN Habitat in particular, and thanks also to the self-organization of local government throughout the world. They have their organizations, and an important report on decentralization has now reached its 3rd edition. It's shed light on the crucial role, the added value that local government can bring to bear, along with other players, in meeting the challenges on the international agenda. So we're living this paradox in a context of accelerated decentralization and urbanization. So we owe a lot to UN Habitat from that point of view, and also to local government and the way they have organized themselves to put their voice forward. What do we talk about? We talk about basic services, water, transport, waste, and all the rest. This really is the competence. It falls squarely within the powers of local government throughout the world. And increasingly so in this trend towards decentralization. Many of these, of course, are crucial to the Millennium Development Goals. Many of these also are a part and parcel of the development goals that the international community has set itself. So if you consider the powers of local government, for instance, in Europe or in other countries that are going towards fast-track decentralization, such as Africa, we really are considering basic services. And while they may not, and those places where they're not really in the competence of local government because of a lack of decentralization, who do the people turn to complain about the lack of services? Local government, because those are the people they've elected. They are the people who will be called to answer for the lack of services. So I think that this debate that we're having is very important. We need to reinforce decentralization, and there where it already exists, we need to empower local government to meet the demand for local services that is coming. Cooperation of decentralized local government, I think, therefore, is key now in determining the effectiveness of development cooperation. The former French Minister of Development Cooperation, Mr. Austin, said that development cooperation is really the daughter of decentralization, because access to basic services and the Millennium Development Goals are really the frame of reference of decentralized cooperation. Decentralized cooperation started this way, but in the 80s it really considered, after the large projects, it considered the need for provision, delivery of basic services to local population, not only in terms of infrastructure, but also providing equipment and also assistance, in forms also of assistance to governance and running projects and working with partners. And I think that another important need that has emerged is how to respond to the need for services in cities that are growing to the tune of 100 or 200,000 people per year. That is where we understand the importance of planning. We can no longer cooperate simply in terms of access to water or sanitation without planning, without working together with our partners to ensure that urbanization takes place on the basis of planning of the urbanization and of the economic activities that need to be in place to meet the challenges of urbanization. So this really is the heart of decentralized cooperation today. The last message here today that I would like to convey is that today we need to think in terms of a cooperation triangle. Decentralized cooperation is no longer an additional part. It really is added value in this triangle in which we have international donors, local government of the south, and also local government of the north. Major donors need, since their policy used to be more sectorial, it's becoming more territorial, they need to rely on local government. Local government people are used to working together, and we're still working in neighborhoods. I think that this is the future of development cooperation. Access to basic services, working together with local government is the future of development cooperation. So supporting both decentralization and supporting the development cooperation that exists for years among these different parties. Thank you.
May I invite VP Ballinger, the Chair and Managing Director of HUDCO, the Housing and Urban Development Corporation of India. And please keep to 2 minutes, otherwise the translators, I'm sure, will slit my throat.
I'll be very brief. First, let me tell you about decentralization. For effective decentralization, we need to transfer 3 Fs: functions, funds, and functionaries. In India, through 74th Constitutional Amendment, we are trying to do this. We have been successful to some extent. I was the Secretary of Local Governments and Rural Gram Panchayats in Karnataka, state of Karnataka. I think our Sweden officer was telling about it. Now I come to my present responsibility. Now I'm the Chairman of Housing and Urban Development Corporation. It's a techno-financing institution. We have funded nearly 1,800 local bodies. For any basic service to be successful, we need proper financing. Nowadays, the central governments or local government, provincial governments are not in a position to give full funding to the local bodies. Therefore, local bodies need to borrow money from financial institutions. My financial institution now is trying to help the local bodies through some creative mechanisms, creative options for borrowing. The sovereign guarantee is not available for many local bodies. Therefore, we provide funds even without sovereign guarantee. We take the property of the municipality as the mortgage. We also provide a security mechanism. We need repayment mechanism. We look for escrowing of their revenues. For example, if we fund water supply and drainage, we see that the local governments are taking up the collection of water rate. They take up the reforms, they charge water supply, at least to some extent O&M has to be recovered from the people, as well as property tax escrowing is done. Therefore, the money that we lend to the local bodies is assured. Sometimes part of the money comes from the central government, part of the money comes from local government, and most of the money comes from the local bodies. We're trying to bring integration between all 3 levels. Thank you very much.
May I ask Professor Makon Young?
Chiedo al professor Mekom Nyango di venire al microfono, 2 minuti. Comincerò a suonare un campanello per farvi 10 secondi per arrivare al podio. Gli altri oratori hanno già introdotto l'argomento molto bene, quindi posso attenermi soltanto ad un esempio che vorrei condividere da parte dei keniani. Noi abbiamo eseguito un processo in 3 fasi: il processo coloniale, in cui c'è stata l'urbanizzazione che ha creato una dicotomia tra coloro che vivevano nelle città e poi coloro che vivevano fuori dalle città. Poi la seconda fase, il processo post-coloniale, in cui non è cambiato molto. Quindi negli ultimi 20 anni il processo è stato un processo di decentramento del sistema amministrativo attraverso nuove forme di politica, e nel 2008 è stata adottata una nuova Costituzione con un impatto notevole sulla legislazione per le 47 contee che sono state create. Ora, se torno a quando il Kenya era ai tempi coloniali, le città sono diventate delle aziende, vengono gestite come delle aziende con 11 membri del Consiglio, un Presidente del Consiglio di amministrazione e un processo democratico interessante che cerca di mettere insieme il sistema pubblico e privato. Quindi si ottiene un ritorno dalla comunità sulla base delle decisioni che vengono prese, e questa è la direzione in cui si vuole andare, gestire le città come delle aziende, oppure vogliamo tornare al processo democratico con gli eletti. Ecco, questa è una dicotomia che abbiamo noi in Kenya oggi, che dovremo affrontare. Grazie. È molto triste che ci sia così poco tempo per discutere questi aspetti, perché il decentramento e questi nuovi sviluppi in Kenya sono molto interessanti. Odo Mela, hai a disposizione 2 minuti, direttore dello sviluppo urbano nel governo locale e innovatore. Ecco, lo ringraziamo del suo intervento. E il professor Amita Kundu, che concluderà la sessione. Sono molto grato a tutti voi della pazienza, mi dispiace che abbiamo dovuto eliminare la discussione, ma se volete potete anche parlare direttamente con gli oratori al termine della sessione. Non esito nel ammettere che è stata diciamo, esagerata la mia capacità di poter riassumere la sessione. Abbiamo ascoltato molti oratori e devo dire che con la mancanza di tempo ovviamente abbiamo dovuto molto accelerare le discussioni. Comunque il decentramento e i servizi di base sono una fase molto importante nello sviluppo delle città. Io ritengo che dare un vantaggio urbano alla società dipende da quanto e come siamo in grado di affrontare la sfida del decentramento in un mondo dove vige la disuguaglianza, soprattutto visto che le raccomandazioni verranno riprese dal Habitat 3 e anche verranno rinnovati gli obiettivi del nuovo millennio oltre il 2015. Ho pensato che avrei appunto rivisto alcuni di questi elementi o obiettivi. Vediamo di riassumere gli aspetti che sono stati presentati in un macro contesto. Le informazioni presentate in questa sessione, ma anche nella mattinata. Quindi la sfida della realizzazione del vantaggio urbano. Una prima provocazione è venuta proprio dal moderatore, dal Presidente, quando ha parlato delle disuguaglianze. Le disuguaglianze a livello della mortalità infantile, l'attesa di vita, non soltanto tra un paese e l'altro, ma tra una città e l'altra, ma anche all'interno delle stesse comunità. Si è parlato di un'attesa di vita che va da 20 anni a 80 anni all'interno della stessa comunità. Se osserviamo i paesi meno sviluppati, andiamo a vedere questi dati, vediamo che su 90 il 60% del paese presenta un reddito, il deficit a livello di sviluppo umano è molto più grave del deficit a livello di reddito. Io ho fatto qualche calcolo rapidamente e ho realizzato questo grafico. Queste sono le perdite nell'indice di alfabetizzazione, la salute e vari indici per vedere quanto sono grandi le disuguaglianze. Il nostro amico dell'Ocse ha introdotto anche l'aspetto dell'equità che rafforza proprio il punto sollevato da David. Osservate il rosso, queste sono le perdite nel reddito tra i paesi sviluppati, il che significa che nei paesi sviluppati le disuguaglianze all'interno del paese sono molto molto forti, ma a livello di disuguaglianze di formazione, di istruzione non sono così grandi. Per quanto riguarda la salute, mortalità materna e infantile, vedete che le differenze sono minime. Osservate invece quali sono i dati per i paesi di medio sviluppo. Vedete che le disuguaglianze sanitarie sono molto forti e questa è la situazione invece dei paesi più poveri, quelli più arretrati. Le disuguaglianze a livello di reddito non sono così grandi, invece a livello di salute, di dati di mortalità infantile e materna, ecco, queste sono le differenze più grandi, quindi parliamo di gravi carenze a livello di alimentazione, di acqua e sistemi fognari. Quindi bisogna affrontare il problema della salute e nel fare questo bisogna garantire un accesso ai servizi di base, quindi l'acqua potabile e sistemi fognari. Se si eliminano queste differenze si riducono le differenze a livello di le differenze per la salute, le differenze sulla mortalità, la mortalità soprattutto infantile. Qui vediamo il quintile più elevato è basso, ma per quello più basso vedete che il divario tra il quintile più alto e quello più basso è enorme. Quindi se si vuole affrontare i problemi della salute, dell'acqua potabile, dei sistemi fognari, bisogna affrontare i problemi delle disuguaglianze all'interno delle città. Ora è possibile fare questo grazie al decentramento. John Close ne ha parlato e gran parte dei partecipanti hanno ricordato o hanno detto che il decentramento, e John aveva ragione nel richiamarlo questo, si pensa che il decentramento sia un problema, sia il problema che quindi porta alla instabilità politica, alle tensioni, violenze e manifestazioni negative. E poi da un altro lato c'è la romanticizzazione, cioè viene visto come una panacea che può risolvere tutti i problemi, garantire l'efficienza e così via. Ma è stato indicato chiaramente che Si tratta di soluzioni che vanno personalizzate e vanno elaborate in base alla realtà locale. Si è parlato di governi locali che finanziano i governi statali, ma questo non è più possibile. Il governo locale non può fare nulla senza l'aiuto dei fondi federali, per esempio. Vorrei ricordare due problematiche di base che ritengo essenziali. La prima cosa che mi colpisce è il punto di vista amministrativo che cambia, che è diverso se visto a livello centrale e a livello locale. Anche nel contesto delle province italiane vi sono dei finanziamenti minimi che vengono dal governo statale. Quindi le bidon deal, il 70% delle bidon deal dovrebbero essere eliminate. Se consideriamo i piani di sviluppo delle città, ebbene questi piani vorrebbero appunto eliminare gli slum. E vi possono essere dei conflitti nel punto di vista tra governo locale e governo centrale. L'architettura dunque di nuove forme di finanziamento sono importanti, ma è importante anche cambiare la mentalità, perché la mentalità che esiste a livello centrale a volte è diversa rispetto a quella delle realtà locali. Un secondo punto, ed è l'ultimo, riguarda il finanziamento. Abbiamo sentito che le autorità locali sono gestite come delle aziende e in molti paesi asiatici su cui ho lavorato troviamo che i governi locali, a loro viene chiesto di mobilizzare le loro risorse, devono ripagare il debito a condizioni di mercato e se non lo fanno possono essere querelate e devono rispondere in tribunale. Ora, in una piccola città di una regione arretrata, ovviamente tutto questo non ha senso, è diverso rispetto alle città, le disuguaglianze sono enormi e David Clark appunto ha detto che vi sono grosse disuguaglianze rispetto appunto ai servizi di base, per cui non vi è accesso al credito, non esistono le risorse per fornire i servizi. Quindi occorre che vi sia una nuova architettura di finanziamento per cui il governo federale deve stabilire quali sono i requisiti di base che tutto il Paese deve raggiungere. Quindi ci possono volere 15 o 20 anni, e quindi si deve pianificare, ma se si dice che la responsabilità della mobilizzazione di finanziamenti è la responsabilità delle zone più arretrate, ebbene questo significa che non si potranno realizzare dei progressi. Ancora due frasi. Questi sono gli obiettivi. Entro il 2015 dobbiamo dimezzare la povertà. Ebbene, a livello globale, questi sono dati molto recenti, e questi dati dimostrano che ci sarà un gap a livello del 7%. E quindi si sta procedendo secondo quanto previsto, ma questo invece è il divario per quanto riguarda la mortalità al di sotto dei 5 anni. Vedete che siamo molto lontani dalla meta e dobbiamo quindi intervenire su questo aspetto che è un problema che va a braccetto con la disponibilità di acqua potabile. Quindi non dobbiamo considerare soltanto la spesa media per la sanità, ma la spesa per l'acqua e i sistemi fognari. E questo è quello che determinerà la salute del popolo e la possibilità di realizzare gli obiettivi del millennio. La prima cosa che devo fare è chiedere scusa presso gli interpreti, perché ho spinto gli oratori a ridurre i loro interventi da 20 minuti in 5 minuti, hanno parlato alla velocità della luce, quindi creando grandi problemi per le interpreti. È stata una sessione molto interessante, mi dispiace non aver avuto più tempo e penso che per la prossima volta dovremo prevedere almeno 4-5 ore, perché sarebbe il caso appunto di ascoltare gli oratori e poi dividersi in piccoli gruppi per discutere a fondo i vari aspetti. Quindi chiudiamo qui la nostra riunione.